Hello and welcome to Just the Facts podcast. This is your April 3rd, 2020 update. My name's Dr. Michael Beachel, and thank you for tuning in again. Today, on our second episode, we are going to have several things going on. First, we're going to give you an updated numbers on the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. We are going to have an interview with Dr. Kelly, MD. And then also speak with one of my students, Irish Starkey. Afterwards, I'll give you a brief preview of future podcasts, and then finally, tell you a little bit of how you can submit new questions. Now, after our first podcast, I can tell you that things just seem to be going outstanding. At this point, we have over 3,200 views, so over 3,200 views on the first podcast between Facebook and YouTube. And to me, that's just simply outstanding. And so to get right into it, let's go ahead and start off by looking at some updated numbers from Chen. And next, I'd like to welcome back to the Just the Facts podcast, Chen, to give us an update. So we spent a lot of time with you last time talking about modeling and what numbers could look like, especially here in the Midwest. And I would say out of the entire broadcast last time, we got the most response and questions and concerns about that modeling software. So thanks for coming back and joining us today, Chen.
Thank you for having me back.
Awesome. So one of the questions that we got a lot was about how do you model? How do you do the modeling math and a little bit about kind of behind the curtains for that. So what I figured I'd do is just start off with a very basic explanation of how this modeling works. And so let's imagine that we are to plot out. So this blue line you see across the screen right now are just some case numbers. So you start off with 0 cases, and in the beginning of these outbreaks, you see virtually no cases, right? Incredibly flat, and then things kind of take a turn. Is that what I'm expecting here, Chen?
Mm-hmm.
And
absolutely. That's called the exponential growth.
All right, so that's what we're kind of going into now is exponential. And so this is where we are kind of right now. We're in the middle of this exponential growth phase. And this is where you see this explosion of cases happening really quick. The numbers just seem to get bigger and bigger every day. And you're able to calculate this first curve very, very well. You can come up with ways of fitting this. But my understanding is that this curve, this exponential growth phase could go on for anything from a few days to a few weeks or even months. And we don't know how long this is going to go, but eventually it will stop. You'll reach what's called the point of inflection, and that's when we'll see the curve kind of flatten out. And that's the part that we're trying to get to is, can we come up with a model to calculate that first curve, and then can we kind of estimate when we're going to flatten out and see a peak? Is that a good interpretation of what you're trying to do mathematically here, Chen?
Absolutely. I guess another way to describe this is an analogy. Imagine you put a rocket on a cart, okay, a little toy cart, okay? And you light that rocket, and it exponentially start to pick up speed, okay? And that's really easy to calculate because it just basically goes faster and faster and faster. But what we don't know is when that rocket runs out of fuel, okay? What we don't know is when this coronavirus is going to run out of fuel. But when that does happen, what's going to happen is once the rocket runs out of fuel, that cart is still going to move really fast, but it's going to also start slowing down because there's no more energy being put into it. Friction and air resistance is starting to slow it down until finally it stops. So that is a good analogy on what I'm trying to predict.
Excellent. And to kind of get this point across, you've actually sent us some content where you can explain a little bit behind the curtains of how you're doing this modeling.
Sure. And this is just a retroactive modeling, okay, and I'll get into that a little bit. So retroactive modeling is we're looking at previous data to predict the next data. I think what the stuff that you do, Dr. Beachel, is you look at factors and try to fit into the models using that way, which is, if you do it right, that is way more powerful than what I'm doing. But what I'm doing is very easy to do, and it's very quick to do to get a small trend going. So for the last week or so, everything we've been modeling has been exponential. Really easy. Imagine that rocket just picking up speed. It's going faster and faster, and it's fitting great. Right here we have 3 states. These are all states that were hit early and hit hard. And as you can see, by using the trend you see right now is exponential, and they do fit, but not very well. You can tell by towards the initial and towards the end, it's off. It's just off, and it was perfectly dead on, but now it's off. Okay. So we're looking at how good it fits by that R square you see on top. Okay, forget the equation part. That is just what we use to get to that R square. Okay. And you can see it's 0.98, 0.96, 0.97, which means it's a 97, 96, 98% fit. Okay, which is pretty good, but not great. Not great, because remember, things change very, very fast. So right now it's fitting okay, but in a few days it will be way off. Okay. And that is not really a good prediction. So what that means is, now that we're not fitting that exponential curve, something is happening. Okay, so here's what's happening. If you want to go to the next slide. All right, so these are the same states. Okay, same data up to today, which is April 4th or 3rd. Sorry, April 3rd, and we're talking at 9 o'clock at night right now, 10 o'clock at night. So data changes hourly. So this is the data I have for now. Okay. Now you see the trend fitting very, very tight now. We went from 96, 97, 98 to almost 100%. 0.004 is the lowest one there.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is, with this new mathematical modeling, this upgraded system, this fitness system, you are able to take the actual data from 3 separate states and make the math fit nearly perfectly what the actual numbers are. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Yeah, so I'm actually kind of excited about this, because this tells me something. So someone might say, hey, why don't you just use this model in the beginning? It doesn't work in the beginning. The reason why is this is algebra or calculus, if anyone paid attention in high school or college. Exponential growth is actually half of the curve on the graph. A second degree or second power polynomial graph is one curve. Think of a U or an N, okay? That's one curve. A third degree polynomial is 2 curves. And guess what? That's what we're looking for. One curve going up and one curve flattening out. So that's 2 curves. Okay. So in the beginning, there was no second curve. It was just one curve. That's why this model doesn't work in the beginning. But the fact that it's working now tells me that there is a second curve coming. Okay. Because it's fitting so much better now.
We have to eventually get to that point of inflection.
Exactly. So what does this mean? It means that we're close to the halftime for these 3 states. Okay. And then these 3 states, the yellow is New York, the red is New Jersey, and the blue is, I believe, California.
Okay. And so you've also taken this modeling system now, and you have compared different states here in the Midwest, right? Which I think is where we're going next.
Right. So to better explain that, if you want to go to the next slide. So New York, New Jersey, and California were all the states that hit initially. So it makes sense that they're getting to their half point, right? But that's not true for all the states. There are some states that are still in that beginning flat line right now. I pulled 4 states, mostly because, my home state and surrounding states, but mostly also because these 4 states are similar regarding population density. So, we're 1 or 2 major cities, but majority is Midwest, right? You got Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio. Now, this is the modeling I've been using. As you can see, they're pretty much exactly in line, all these 4. And that makes sense right now because they are still in that first curve. They haven't changed yet. But
we're in our exponential growth phase. So if I'm reading your chart correctly here, you have all the red data that you're showing here is actually from Ohio. This is actual data. And so today, in Ohio, you had 2,902 total cases in Ohio is what you're up to. And so according to this model, in 1, 2, 3, 4 more days, you could expect your total cases in Ohio to be somewhere in the ballpark of around 6,000. Is that
exactly? Yeah.
Correctly?
Yeah. So, it definitely could. But if you notice that that curve, as well as lining up, is also a little bit off towards that middle. And that is something that, I need to pay attention to. Now, what you notice is that blue bars, those are Illinois. Okay. Illinois, once again, I think it was like the 2nd or 3rd state that got hit. And notice how towards the end there, Illinois is not fitting very well.
Okay.
Now, in stats, data goes up and down. There is an error. I don't know if this is a blip in the data or if this will become a trend. Only time will tell. Maybe 2 or 3 more days, maybe tomorrow. But you will start to see that Illinois doesn't fit very well towards the last 2 days.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does that mean? So I switched everything to another modeling point, and you can see now that it's a lot closer. This is the same modeling I used, the third degree polynomial. So that 2 curve. So what that means is Illinois is straightening out. It's straightening out. So that means the rocket, that analogy I was using earlier, it's getting ready to running out of fuel.
So what you're saying here is that it looks like Illinois, if this model holds true over the next few days, Illinois is reaching that point of inflection where we're going to start to see over the next, potentially, if this is correct, over the next several days, Illinois will start the process of flattening out. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that part we don't know yet. It could be a couple days, it could be it could be even more, a week or more. But the point is, it is coming. It is coming. We're no longer in a uncontrolled exponential explosion. It means right now, something is happening where it's no longer climbing as fast as it was.
Very good.
And if you look at Indiana and Ohio, look how much better that R square is compared to the previous graph. That Ohio, I think, was 98 or 97, but now it's almost, so that's a 98%. Now it's almost 100% fit.
Wow.
So what that means is, if you go on toggle back and forth, you see that both Indiana and Ohio is dropping a little bit more, significantly actually, from the prediction.
Yeah, so ultimately what this means is that social distancing may be working. Mm-hmm. We may be flattening the curve. And so just a refresher, with that flattening of the curve, what we're doing is we're not necessarily decreasing the total number of infections, but we're spreading the infections out over time to give our hospital systems a fighting chance. And so mathematically, it's starting to look like flattening the curve is working, at least.
Right.
This preliminary, very, very preliminary data.
Right.
This is cutting edge. I mean, this is all up to date as of tonight at 10 o'clock at night. Friday night, 10 o'clock at night, this is current data. So that's pretty exciting news.
Right, and I want to give a disclaimer out. With anything like statistics, there's always a chance for error. So I don't want to. I hope I don't eat my words in a few days, but we shall see. We shall see. The trend can change.
Sure.
It could be a dip. It's just random a dip. But this is the reason why I chose the top 3 states, because the top 3 states have so much data, so much N. The power of the change is a lot more. Think of the difference between a motorcycle and a semi-truck, right? When you see a swerve on a semi-truck, it's a lot more noticeable than you see a swerve on a motorcycle.
Yeah.
So
I think that's very true. And so the disclaimer, I think, is needed that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but what we can do is look at the math, we can look at the modeling, and we can try our very best. And with the data that we have as of right now, this is our very best way of predicting. And so
yeah.
I think you're doing fantastic work. I really, really do appreciate you coming in, coming back on the show, giving our viewers an update. It's truly been great. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I let you go?
No, I think everybody. I think the math looks good. Let's meet up again in the near future and see if I'm right or wrong.
That sounds great. We'll continue this mathematical modeling. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Chen, and we'll have you on the show again soon.
Okay, keep washing those hands and social distancing.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. That was just a great update. I hope that helps clarify some of what we're seeing with the numbers on the ground. Next, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Victoria Kelly. Dr. Victoria Kelly is a medical doctor, and she is currently practicing at the University of Toledo Medical Center Department of Psychiatry, where she is the General Psychiatry Residency Program Director. Also, she's in the Department of Family Medicine there as a collaborative care psychiatrist. Additionally, she is an associated faculty at the Ohio State University Medical Center Department of Psychiatry. I would just like to take this moment to again welcome and thank Dr. Victoria Kelly for coming on our show.
Welcome, and thanks for having me. I'm a psychiatrist over in Toledo, Ohio, and right now the coronavirus pandemic is affecting us all, but it's about to hit us harder in this next upcoming month. So I thought it was really important to get out there the word for other people who are wanting to know what to do, how to handle everything when it's going on, to get some help out there for them. So I help a lot with education at the University of Toledo. I'm in charge of education for the Department of Psychiatry. So it falls right within what I normally do. And this is one way that I can give back. So I put this talk together as a means of discussion for the therapists and other clinicians throughout the whole hospital system, because everyone on the front lines, everyone in healthcare is going to be trying to help people through this. So we'll talk a little bit about what pandemics are, some of the data with that, the difference between quarantine and how that affects us, including isolation and loneliness, and the unexpected issue of having to parent and homeschool while also going through this pandemic right now, and just some base techniques that can be helpful when talking with patients. So one of the questions that comes up is, why is this so hard for us in America to really get it, to understand it? And one thing to think of is we haven't been hit by anything like this for most of our collective memories for our current generations. You know, other countries around the world have had to deal with traumatic events, hurricanes, tsunamis, But we haven't here in the United States. So we are left with this brand new experience that we have to figure out what to do. And with that is, we don't know what to do. We don't even know what we should be feeling, what we should be knowing. And so when we deal with a threat that is unfamiliar versus a threat that's familiar, like a snake or, you know, a spider, our brains light up even more, and our amygdala, which is a part of the brain involved with processing our emotional response, it has way higher activity. And so right now, you know, across the nation, our brains are just lighting up. And another thing that is really important that I don't think a lot of people understand right now is, besides the anxiety and fear, which we can all recognize, is that we actually are grieving. You know, there's gatherings, there's graduations, there's weddings that we can't do, we can't host. And so there's this huge element of grief that, unless you acknowledge that that's a part of what's going on in your experience, it's actually going to perpetuate your psychological difficulties and make it harder to move on and exist through this pandemic. So, you know, we have the loss of our routines, the certainty of our health, and all these plans. And then sometimes there's the relief that we might feel because we're not out on the front lines, or, you know, something like that. And then we immediately feel guilty about that. Now, one of the populations of people that are a higher risk of having difficulties right now is if you already have a pre-existing mental health disorder, specifically depression and anxiety. Without a doubt, the isolation can make things worse. Now, it's been really, really interesting to find across the board, nothing research and evidence-based here, but just in terms of talking with my colleagues across the nation, many of our patients that we work with, they're either doing a lot better or, as expected, worse. So you may wonder, like, why are they feeling better right now? And on one hand, it's a form of validation that the entire world is now experiencing what they feel on a daily basis, the isolation and depression and sadness and or anxiety, and especially individuals with OCD, if they have a phobia of germs, for example, they, to some extent, now people understand some of the fixation and compulsions that they might have. So there are certain disorders that may require a little bit more specific treatments or attentions, but overall, if there is some form of a pre-existing mental health disorder, it's really important to really take care of yourself and be aware of what you need. But when it comes to the decrees and directives that have come out, there's the social distancing, quarantine, and isolation. And this slide details the differences between those things. Now, I know for me and many of us in healthcare, when the directive came out that we should be social distancing, we just self-quarantine at that moment in time. So it hasn't been as much of a difficulty for some of us. Isolation is a step farther, though. That's if you are known or very strongly suspected to have the illness, that you isolate yourself off. So these are the heartbreaking images that we see on social media of doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists when they have to see their loved ones, you know, through a partition because they're treating people on the front lines and they don't want to infect their family. So as expected, if you are distancing yourself from others socially and physically, you're going to feel isolated. Now, it's important to realize, though, that even before this pandemic hit us, that a whole bunch of us in America had already felt lonely. And that is very important because then you add this extra strain and the rates of loneliness are going to go up. And you see on the bottom there just a reminder of the different generations. And I think it was funny. They went viral, the spring break in Florida, and how everybody was blaming the millennials. And then the millennials said, hey, that's not us. We're the ones at home, very scared for our parents, like you want Gen Z. So, just something to keep in mind. But, we often may blame millennials, but the reality is we're all in this together. But so one thing that people often do, and the question comes up, is like, why is everybody buying toilet paper? Because, the primary symptom of the COVID-19 isn't a GI symptom. So what we find is that it's fear. It's a loss of avoidance of something that they are afraid that they won't be able to have. Of course, you have the individuals who buy up things because they want to turn a profit. But I thought the slide here on the side was funny also, because Gen X, of which I'm a club member, you know, the stockpiling of alcohol actually went up even more so than cleaning supplies and paper products.
Priorities.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, these are some theories as to why hoarding in general happens during pandemics. And, you know, one of them is that the value of a product is positively related to its scarcity. So if more people want toilet paper, its value goes up even more, even regardless. So I don't want to focus on that, but it is mostly fear-based. And the general recommendation for pandemic purchasing is that you essentially buy about double of what it is that you would need. Go out so that you can go out less often. But outside of that, the supply chains are fairly reasonable. And what they found from past history, if I go back up a slide, after the earthquakes in Chile and Japan, that, you know, when we hoard up our inventory in the stores, that it's going to affect the supply chain down the road too. So that they had things out of stock for even 6 months later because everybody bought things up in the pandemic.
Interesting.
So if you look at loneliness, you know, it's not a diagnosis or anything like that. And if you look at it as a neural mechanism, so just like hunger motivates us to seek food, loneliness would motivate us to seek a social connection. And what they found was, what it kind of boils down to, the 4 things that lead to loneliness is a lack of social support, too few meaningful social interactions, poor physical and mental health, and not enough balance in our lives. And this, through probably an epigenetic mechanism where you turn certain genes on or off, leads to a lot of poor health outcomes. And it may actually be one of the factors, it's hypothesized, for example, why women live longer than men, because women typically have stronger and more social contacts. So, you know, according to different data points that are out there, people who don't feel connected are more likely to catch a cold, experience depression, develop heart disease, have lower cognitive functioning, and live a shorter life. And that the long-term harm caused by loneliness alone is similar to as if you were smoking 15 cigarettes a day, or obesity. You know, and so those aren't, you know, they're very impressive if you think about it.
It's not trivial at all.
Yeah, as we take a step back, then, you know, how does that fit in with the pandemic and what we have to do right now? Is like, okay, well, what is normal reaction to what's going on versus an abnormal or dysfunctional reaction? So people often use the phrase cabin fever or feeling stir crazy. And I think cabin fever probably takes it up a notch, because we imagine like Jack Nicholson in The Shining when he's a little isolated with his family for a little bit of time. Yeah. But, you know, it's important to keep in mind that it is not an actual mental disorder, and it's a normal reaction to what is going on. So you can see here that there's a lot of different symptoms: anxiety, panic, sadness, low mood, mood swings, anger, even emotional exhaustion. You can feel almost restless or claustrophobic, even paranoid a little if it goes on too long, and problems with sleep and concentration. So for most people, they'd be like, yeah, that looks like a mental disorder here. It looks like there's something really wrong. But what you find is that most people are still able to do what they need to do. They can still do their chores. They can still take care of their kids. So when it becomes an actual problem is when it becomes a disorder. And most commonly, the thing we would look out for the most in the short term is what we would call an acute stress disorder. So it lasts anywhere from 3 days to a month after the traumatic event. And about 20% of people will develop an acute stress disorder after some sort of a traumatic event. It goes up to about 50% if it's a sexual assault. And it's, you can have experienced it, or you could have heard about it, or have vicarious and repeated exposure to traumatic events. For example, people who man hotlines or 911 callers or anything like that. And the last part here, the outcome of acute stress disorder is best when the victim has access to immediate crisis management therapy. and also that the acceptance and commitment therapy is an effective therapeutic intervention. So outside of the world of therapy, people probably don't really understand what acceptance and commitment therapy is. But if you have been about self-improvement and accepting yourself and trying to be more mindful or doing more yoga, things like that, there's going to be components of this that you will absolutely recognize. So you see here a comparison between the cabin fever versus acute stress disorder. Not a lot of differences, but acute stress disorder kind of takes it up the next level. And you can have dissociation in addition to the avoidance behaviors. So you think, okay, this is normal, right? Cabin fever, I get it. I'm not going to be cooped up forever. It's not the end of the world. So how do I deal with it? So one of the things is to get outside. Now, we're not talking to go cram the metro parks and, you know, create a social distancing hazard, but, you know, go outside your backyard, the neighborhood, wherever you can, and try to interact with nature. There's a lot of data out there that suggests that interacting with nature promotes cognitive functioning, ability to think and process, and it can support positive mood and overall well-being. And then you want to set goals. So it doesn't matter how tiny they are. So it's like, you know, I'm going to do the dishes today, or I'm going to take the first step in this other longer process. But basically setting some goals for yourself and checking it off allows you to feel productive during this time. And lastly is use your brain. Now, if you haven't seen the Tiger King documentary on Netflix, you know, it just recently was, they came out and said that it is the third most popular show behind The Walking Dead and Westworld. So, you know, there is the risk of just vegetating on the couch and watching a bunch of TV. But, you know, if you can do that, okay. But, you know, more often what is helpful is actually using your brain productively rather than just passively.
It is striking how popular that series has become in such a short period of time.
It's amazing, yes. So the other thing is to maintain normal eating patterns. Now, this is really, really hard to do because as it is, people stress eat. Now people are stressed, anxious, afraid, and they have nothing but time on their hands and access to their kitchen cabinet. So, you know, it is important to try as best you can to maintain normal eating patterns and then exercise. Now, you know, people always say, oh, exercise is my New Year's resolution. And then statistically, that's not the case, that people are able to follow through with that. But it's a really good time if you want to do it to go ahead and start. And what they found, though, was even people who exercise regularly, if you took a break for 1 month, you lost whatever it was that you had gained with your aerobic capacity, helping with your insulin sensitivity and cholesterol. So it's like if you don't use it, you lose it. So, you know, you don't need to add a bunch of extra pressure to yourself, but it's a good way to help mitigate some of the anxiety in addition to the other like cardiovascular benefits too. And lastly is limit your media consumption. Like, oh my goodness, I don't know how many times I have to stress this because you turn on Facebook, you turn on the news, like it's all alarms everywhere about how horrible everything is. And what we do know is that the more of this media that you consume, the worse that you're going to feel. This has been well documented after other national disasters and school shootings and traumatic events like that. The recommendation always limit your media consumption and only do it at set times from reliable fact-based sources. If you just allow yourself free reign access, you're gonna feel bad and it's gonna worsen your anxiety. And, you know, people always say maintain your social connections. You know, for some of us who live in a middle to upper class, a socioeconomic bubble, like, sure, no problem, it's easy. We have free access, what seems like free to our children at least, you know, internet and video games and those sorts of things. But for a lot of people, they don't have that. And that's one of the things that's become obvious as we've tried to incorporate more telehealth into our healthcare system, is that some of the patients just don't have the ability, capabilities, they don't have the technology, or they don't have the data plans that allows them to do this. So it's really easy for us to sit on our high horse and say, oh, just use this or that, when the reality is that there's a lot of us Americans who, maybe aren't as, they don't have as many resources. So whatever you can do is what you do.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's just striking how many people forget that access is a key point. And so moving everything online sounds great, but that is making a huge assumption of access. I really
absolutely. It brings a disparity glaringly into the light. Yeah, without a doubt. And so here are 2 links, though, so for people who enjoy getting together, social events, there's some video games, online versions of games to play, like Cards Against Humanity. Netflix, you can do a Netflix party where you all watch the same show at the exact same time, and so there's ways that it can happen. And I thought this was hilarious. So the World Health Organization says, hey, video games is an effective way to stop the spread of COVID-19. This is 1 year after they had added gaming disorder to its list of addictive behaviors. So perspective is everything.
Yes.
But that is definitely one thing that even unofficially parents have noticed, is like when they check their children's phone usage, they're on their phones gaming or consuming social media and very, very high numbers. And like Nintendo Switch, Animal Crossing, New Horizons just came out, and when it came out, it instantly smashed records, and it came out during the directive here in Ohio anyway for quarantine. And then there's another way, if you enjoy gaming with other people, you can use Steam. So one of the things I recommend to patients a lot is, if it's short-term quarantine and your patients generally have they'll get through this okay, they're not high risk, kind of middle of the road, you can look at it as attitude, right? So life is a combination of what happens to you and also what you do about it. Now, I did not come up with this quote about training like an astronaut. It came from an astronaut who, again, was very isolated up in space. But they say it's basically your attitude. You can look at your time right now as an adventure in a confined space with a small crew for a long mission, with occasional spacewalks and resupply missions, But this kind of outlook on things doesn't necessarily come intuitively, and it usually comes after people have kind of processed things a little. But it's also like people who've experienced other traumatic things like sexual assaults or violent attacks. It's like they didn't ask for it. It just happened to them, but you do have some level of personal responsibility of what you do with it afterwards. So right now, like, nobody asked for coronavirus to be coming over and to put all of our lives on hold. But what we do about it can affect our mindset, our feelings, our thoughts, and the longer term. So then, of course, okay, that's like the general people who have decent coping skills to just survive short-term cabin fever quarantine. So who is at highest risk of having longer-term problems? There are actually specific populations. And what we can only do right now is extrapolate from the past. So a lot of studies were done after the swine flu and Ebola, and what they found was that if you generally tend to have a hopeless attitude, that there's nothing that you can do about something, you feel helpless, or if you have difficulty tolerating uncertainty, those definitely made it more likely that you were going to have longer term problems. In addition, if you knew someone who was hospitalized, and then if you yourself had to be quarantined, it raised the rates 3 to 4 times higher. Now here in the United States, what they're saying with approximately 60%, of asymptomatic carriers, we're all quarantined right now. So the likelihood of us knowing someone who is hospitalized while we are also quarantined is really high right now. In addition, if you already had a history of major depressive disorder, or depression was a part of your current symptoms, those individuals were at higher risk. And then, of course, caretakers and healthcare workers on the front lines. And then quantity of days, 10 days, anything over 10 days of quarantine. Now here, we're on I don't even know, 3 weeks in? That's what it feels like.
Yeah,
A year in. But
it's going to be a little bit of time here, I think.
yeah, so anything over 10 days of quarantine. So what they're actually saying is that, once this is done in about 3 to 6 months, is that there's going to be a mental health epidemic of post-traumatic stress disorder because of this, all the quarantine related difficulties. So the longer term risks, again, from the past studies where they showed that PTSD and alcohol use, those were the highest ones, could show up even up to 3 years after the quarantine ended. And then unexplained somatic symptoms, that's like physical health symptoms, pain and fatigue. And one thing that most people don't think about is child abuse and domestic violence. So it's a perfect storm right now, right? You're cooped up in your house. You don't have great coping skills. You might have lost your job. Your kids are not in school. Money is tight, so it's a horrible perfect storm for violence at home. So one of the points that I talk with in a hospital setting is to make sure that if you are working with someone who's at risk, that you absolutely discuss safety related issues. And then guilt and stigma, yeah, after the quarantine, I mean, right now, there's little baby Yoda here, right? I mean, you cough or sneeze and people just instantly, move away from you. But, sometimes there's guilt about being a survivor or guilt that you couldn't have done more. And then, of course, agoraphobia. So that is an actual anxiety disorder and literally means fear of the public square. But basically what happens is your brain perceives the environment to be unsafe and there's no way to escape it. So often it can be triggered by going into open spaces, public transportation, shopping centers, and can result in panic attacks. And obviously you can see how that could be very problematic, because then you can get to a point if you never left your home. So the other things that we're all facing, again, different socioeconomic statuses, different essential job workers, the varying levels, but financial stress without a doubt. Even physicians, people often think that we have this like golden, we're protected in some way, but there's private practices and physicians even that are shuttering practices because of this, let alone people who work in other less protected industries. So losing your job, and then what do you also lose? Your health insurance. So then it makes you even more afraid of what to do in the event you get sick. What we've also experienced, and it sounds like you have to, is educational loss, right? Educating someone face to face
Absolutely.
is different than doing it virtually. And is it better than nothing? Sure, but there's a huge learning curve. It is just not the same. And then the other question that comes up is, your personal safety. If things get really bad, am I going to be safe? Is my family going to be safe? Someone tries to come take stuff from us. And what we know is, gun ownership, more people die by suicide during their first year of gun ownership than all the other causes of death combined due to a gun. So, nobody's really suggesting that people go out and do that. However, that is a real thing that people are facing. So Dr. Russ Harris, he was the author of The Happiness Trap. He came up with this mnemonic, which I thought was really, really great. And again, I mentioned the acceptance and commitment therapy, abbreviated there as ACT. And it's useful because it invites people to kind of open up to unpleasant feelings. Too many times these days, we can't tolerate anything negative, right? We just deflect, we avoid, we just can't tolerate any negative feelings. And one of my favorite movies is Inside Out, the kids movie.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because it's like every emotion has a place, right? Even the quote unquote negative ones. And without the whole totality of it, you're just not having a human experience. So anyway, ACT is useful because it does say, it opens yourself up to it, and you learn to not overreact to some negative feeling or avoid situations that bring them up, and can lead to a very positive outcome about understanding yourself. here's the acronym for FACE COVID. Now, the FACE are actually for any anxiety that issue that may come up. It's not unique to COVID or the pandemic that's going on now. So the F is to focus on what's in your control. So that's the whole thing of like, I'm feeling both scared and relieved and a little happy, you know, to just kind of acknowledge it all. You take a pause. What am I feeling? You have some introspection and think about it. But you don't need to focus on the anxiety or the negatives, but you just observe them. And the A is to acknowledge whatever it is that's going on. And then you're going to move on to accept yourself, accept and anchor yourself back to reality. So the C is to come back into your body. And that is more like the mindfulness practices that you might think of, like deep breathing exercises, grounding exercises, and you know, those are pretty easy to do. And you can go through your senses. What do you see, smell, taste, and hear? Another one is that you can work your way up from your toes all the way to your face. You know, you tighten your muscles and you release them one muscle group at a time. And what that does on the neurological level is that it's training your brain that it's okay to have this negative feeling, meaning that pressure from like holding your fist tight, because it will get better. And the more and more that you can do this in a safe, non-threatening way, it creates those neural pathways so that when something actually negative happens, that your brain's more likely to use that pathway where it just kind of bloop, like, okay, it's not so bad. So it's a non-threatening way to exercise your mind. And the E for face is to engage in what you're doing, because too many times with anxiety, it's you have one foot stuck in the past and one foot stuck in the future. So you refocus on what you're doing. You look around. What are you literally seeing, smelling, tasting? And then what were you actually doing? And so you can do these dropping anchor exercises, as he calls them, for a few minutes and cycle through it, you know, a few times. And by that time, it should be pretty much within your control with the anxiety symptoms. Again, doesn't have to be the pandemic. It's pretty useful for all anxiety.
That's great.
COVID is a little more specific to what's going on now. And this is like, all right, what can I do? So the C is committed action. Instead of being like a passive bystander in all this, what can you do? You can do something, whether it's, you know, actively looking out for your own health and hygiene, or maybe it's a way to look after others. There's a lot of people out there now sewing masks, right? So they are committing to some action of whatever it is that they can do. O is the opening up. So it kind of it circles back to the whole thing of acknowledging everything that's going on, the emotional roller coaster. And then asking yourself, if someone I love is going through this and they're feeling what I'm feeling, if I wanted to be kind and caring towards them, what would I do? How would I treat them? And then do that. So for a lot of us, we're a lot harder on ourselves than we would be for those that we care about. So this is about opening up and being nice to yourself, which circles to a lot of the stuff that's floating out there now on social media about saying, screw this productivity expectation. You want to do nothing and relax and, you know, not worry about the homeschooling, go for it. So, you know, to a certain extent, I am absolutely a fan of this. You got to be kind to yourself. And the V is values. What do you want to stand for? When you look back at this time in your life, you know, what kind of person do you want to be recognized as or having done? And so for this, people often, it's like whatever their strengths are. So if you're a funny person, you're going to be known for helping perhaps relieve the tension for other people. So, you know, just kind of actively choosing what kind of person and reaction you want to do. And the I is to identify resources. So find out where you can get help. And again, for a lot of us, it may not be an issue, but for a lot of us, it sure is. So whether it's from churches, from the government, from different social service programs, from mental health boards, for example, there's a lot of places out there. And then the resources that, like I had mentioned earlier, about like reliable, fact-driven coronavirus updates. And the last D, I should just call it duh, because it is disinfect and distance yourself.
There you go.
So, yeah. So, back to that question of who do I want to be during this pandemic, right? The fear zone says, I'm just going to hoard stuff. I'm going to complain all the time. I'm just going to radiate anger and fear to everybody. And, that's where a lot of people are in the beginning. But what we hope is that they can process it and get a little handle on the anxiety so they can move on to the learning or even growth stuff. That would be the best. And then the last thing that Dr. Harris had mentioned was, he quoted Winston Churchill that when you're going through hell, just keep going. Like, it's not going to last forever.
That's right.
One thing people have found is like the silver lining, right? Like, you're stuck. You said you wanted more time with your family. Well, now you got it. So what you end up doing is you do connect differently with others. And through FaceTime and these other things, perhaps you are connecting with people more meaningfully, like grandma in the nursing home than you had before when you hadn't even visited, for 3 months or something. And people are connecting with nature. Clarifies relationships. Now that's an interesting one. So there's I would almost say it's an epidemic of busyness, not a productive one, but just we do too much in life. And we think things are important when they're really not, or people are. And so during this time, it actually clarifies if you're making an effort to remain in touch with someone, that person's probably important. But if they're not in your life and you're kind of okay with that, maybe they kind of don't need to be in there when this is over either. Again, it helps you reevaluate where your priorities are at the moment. Yeah. And then, sometimes, I think probably more so earlier on, is that you can finally take care of all those neglected chores. Like, I think I myself, like, I've organized my closet, the laundry room,
Get some projects done.
Yeah, but then you run out of it, or you're tired of being productive. But and if you're up for it and you want to, you can absolutely start a new hobby, and that goes with keeping your mind busy. And another silver lining is that I think more people are aware now about certain healthcare issues and scientific principles, and it can help reframe your problems. And I think one of the good things is this was a meme that went viral with our grandparents had to go fight in a war to win. All we have to do is sit at home.
Don't mess with women.
Yeah, so it reframes things a little bit. And okay, so another huge population that we work with are parents. And for this, it was a thing of, in my personal practice, I work a lot with women's mental health issues. And so parenting comes up a lot with that too. In addition to healthcare workers, are parents. So on both sides, we're dealing with this a lot. Of course, in a perfect world, this is what it would look like. It would look all beautiful and scheduled, and the kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But what we find is that, that's not quite how it is in real life. All the best laid plans. So what we find is that this is not really a great time for parents, because, all that uncertainty that we have is multiplied for our kids. And now they're out of school, so parents are either going to be expected to homeschool or find childcare when everybody's supposed to be distancing themselves, if they're an essential worker. Their kids' routines are out of sync, and all of this is just very difficult. They had done a study that found on average as parents, we spend about 1 to 2 hours per day total on direct childcare, like directly interacting with your child. If you added up all the little snippets of time here and there, 1 to 2 hours. So now it's 24/7. So that's really difficult. In addition to the things I mentioned earlier about financial and food insecurity.
Just adds another layer.
It adds absolutely another layer. And so it is important for a parent to understand that their kids are probably going to be acting a little different. They're going to be a little more clingy, needing more of your attention. And so although we as parents may be irritated and annoyed, you want to try to still make yourself more available to the children and understand that they may be regressing a little bit, more crying, more moodiness, irritability. And this is amplified if it's in a co-parenting situation with divorced families. And I mean, it's like the wild, wild west out there right now with that. And everybody's just kind of doing their best. And unfortunately, it's the kids who are stuck in the middle. And so it's really important, again, working with people who have kids, that they have some extra coping skills. So what do I tell parents? If you're gonna do this and have kids during this time, take care of yourself first, number one. It's like the airplane analogy, right? You know, if the oxygen masks come down, you put them on yourself first before you reach out to help anybody else. You, as a parent, you want to help teach your kid these positive preventative measures and social distancing, keep them close, maintain familiar routines as much as possible, and age-appropriate activities. Now, schools in general have been doing a pretty good job of offering up resources, and other places like libraries. I mean, they do pretty good about advertising what options that they have. And then we do also suggest talking with your kids. You know, this always comes up, always, always, always after anything. So like I mentioned, those horrible traumatic things that happen, like shootings, is that yes, you absolutely should talk to your children. And this guide here is ubiquitous for talking with your kids about something serious or important. Is number one, listen. Listen first about whatever they say, their concerns or questions, if they are misinformed, and then you can guide the narrative, and you want to talk with them about whatever it is they're feeling. You want to try to be calm, reassuring, be honest and accurate, but like, we don't know, and it's okay to say, I don't know. But you want to say it more like that, like I'm puzzled, I don't know, instead of like, oh my God, I don't know. Because, you know, kids will pick up on that, definitely. We want to try to avoid blaming, bullying, negative comments, or racist comments, or, you know, blaming an entire race for bringing the virus. So we want to try to be appropriate, and then age-appropriate language and knowledge is important too, and to help kids understand, like, because they don't understand that this isn't like just a snow play date where you can still go out and have play dates and sleepovers and all of that. So being able to explain to them at their level what's going on. And the take-home message that the adults are trying to keep everyone safe and happy, and then whatever it is those kids are feeling, if it's boredom, loneliness, fear, to help the kids find some positive way to express those negative feelings. And then, like, what if you're parenting your parents? You know, often the middle-aged generation, you have both your children and your parents to help take care of. So being at higher risk of problems with coronavirus, you're worried about them too, and their distancing. Do they have their healthcare living wills? Who's going to make decisions? And in the event, if they were to pass, you know, you can't even congregate for a funeral, and arranging things from afar. So it's very stressful. And these are difficult conversations, but they should be had with your parents if that's the case. And the last kind of special population that I often get questions about is pregnancies and women who are currently pregnant. Yeah. And the long and the short of it is, we just don't know. You know, is anything bad going to happen to my baby because I'm pregnant? We don't know. You know, and that is probably the most frustrating thing of it. And this link down here, I think, is a nice resource that it can answer the questions. But in the end, that's what it is. We don't know. So
It's fair though. It's fair.
yeah, so we can model things off of the other SARS epidemics or pandemics that have come by, which have shown that it's like probably going to be okay. But then we also have evidence of viruses for like the Zika virus, you know, first trimester exposure, and you get filled with microencephaly, you know, of having a small head, and you get later third trimester exposure, and you have higher risk of schizophrenia and autism. So that's actually one of the fears that we have in the world of psychiatry these days, is that even if there isn't any more immediate consequence than perhaps early labor, that what's going to happen in 15, 20 years from now to the rates of schizophrenia, because what can happen when a virus does infect a mom and it gets to the fetus in the third trimester is what's happening in the baby in that third trimester is neuronal development. So the brain pathways, baby's pretty much physically grown, but it's like fine tuning the brain pathways. So anything that can disrupt that is very problematic. So it's very scary time. And so the recommendations I make for my patients who are pregnant are essentially, you are a vulnerable population. If they talk about old people, smokers, people with breathing problems, immunocompromised. When you're pregnant, you are essentially immunocompromised because all fetuses are basically little parasites that we, want usually, but they still are. So it does put us in a state of mild, being immunocompromised. So yeah, you should really make sure you are quarantining. You should really make sure you don't go out. You should really wash your hands a lot. And then otherwise, just directing them to their OBGYN. It's also really scary because, we think with the coronavirus, we are hearing now about, no visitors are allowed in the hospital. So if your loved one gets sick, you can't give them any support. And if they pass, you can't say goodbye. What we're finding on women who are pregnant is that they can't have their partners or loved ones in the hospital room. See, similar. And so again, we circle back to the topic of grief. Like all the plans that you had and what you wanted to do, they can't happen. And so there does require a kind of a mental reframing, and you allow for that grief, but you still need to move on and still come up with a plan that at least can make the best of it for you. And many pregnancy-related services can still happen, and they can still be considered urgent. Nowadays they've canceled a lot of elective appointments and procedures, but pregnancy is a unique situation, so I definitely say that for people to check with their OBGYN's office too. So if we now segue into okay, great, now what do we do about this? So one of the things, I try not to be paternalistic, you should go exercise 30 minutes every day. That's unrealistic and it's not going to happen for a lot of people. So how do we help? Well, okay, what did you do beforehand? Before the world caught fire, what did you do and how did you deal with stress? And what worked for you? What didn't work? Well, how about we repeat what did work and don't do what didn't work? And then you focus in, what can you do today or tonight to help you deal with your stress? So kind of refocuses back in the here and now. I think we all know, you probably shouldn't binge eat. You shouldn't be sleep deprived. You shouldn't be using, drugs and alcohol, just sitting on watching TV all day or doing other risky behaviors. It's easy to say that, but the psychological first aid says, take care of yourself. Use what you've got, support system. If you're spiritual or religious, and keep active. Make those to-do lists. So these are all things that, we had already talked about. So in summary, working with people in the hospital or front lines, that we're all on these front lines. And all of the things that I had mentioned about when I talk with patients about, they should apply to myself too, and everybody else, in addition to clinical work. And then in general, if you are in a clinical role taking care of patients, if they have concerns about the increased anxiety and fears related to coronavirus, that you be available to validate their emotions. And really to get through it though, you focus on the short term, concrete goals. Again, uncertain times are very difficult. So a lot of times you want to try to get a sense of control over what you can, that's why the little goals. And of course, evaluate for safety, because, if you are having thoughts of death or dying or taking your own life, that would be indicative of you better get some professional help. And telehealth is, almost all the barriers to that have been completely removed over this past month since essentially March 6th. And so it's amazing. It's going to completely transform the ability for people to get mental health services. So, and then there's a few last slides here. This is about additional resources for mental health. If you're a healthcare worker, you can get the Headspace app for free for a few months. And there's, of course, other crisis lines. And these NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the CDC, they often have very good resources. Exercise. So a lot of places are going to virtual exercises, either through Zoom or some other platform or Facebook. So there's even ways to get exercise. And these are other examples of virtual tours that have been known for the public, and activities for kids or for people who are kids at heart too.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those slides. I'll make sure to put those links in the description of the talk today. I really appreciate all that information. Just a few last quick questions for you. You were talking about the acute stress disorder, and how does somebody really know when they're maybe moving away from acute distress disorder and maybe into something else more like post-traumatic stress or something like that, where they maybe need some help? What are some transitioning points they should look out for?
Yeah, I think the big thing from like regular cabin fever distress to acute stress disorder is the impairment in functioning. And the biggest thing from acute to post-traumatic stress disorder is just time. So technically, if it's less than a month, then it's acute stress. But if your symptoms last longer than 1 month, then it's post-traumatic stress disorder. So, from a medication perspective, the serotonin-based medications, what we call SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those have been shown to be pretty helpful, especially for PTSD. Acute stress, in general, of course, we try to avoid medications if at all possible. So if it's something as shorter term and the therapy and behavioral interventions can work, then fantastic. If you can't, symptoms are severe, you're having even psychotic symptoms or thoughts of death or dying, that will probably necessitate medications and a higher level of services. But the symptoms between acute stress, post-traumatic stress are essentially the same. It's the time course that's really the distinguishing factor there. So that's why regardless of whatever it is, the sooner you get into treatment, hopefully you can nip it in the bud. It doesn't become the longer version. But, sometimes people have a genetic loading in their family, or they don't have as other protective factors, and it puts them at a higher risk of, having the longer term risk for it.
Excellent. And I really do appreciate you talking about the 911 call centers, because I think a lot of focus has been done for providers and medical professionals that are in the hospital settings in terms of highlighting those struggles. But I don't think a lot of the providers or medical assistants that are outside of the hospital have been showcased enough. And so thank you so much for highlighting what these people outside of the hospital system, these providers, are going through in that environment too. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I mean, we're all in this together. Nobody needs to, it's not a question of who's a bigger victim here. We're all victims in this together.
No, that's great.
So the more we can do to lift each other up is better.
Now, we are going to be hearing from a student as well, one of the students in my virology class, and she is from Asia, and she is, slightly personally concerned about her safety, being subject to maybe some issue.
Sure.
She works in hospital systems. And so what would you say to foreign students or people like that are having this extra level of anxiety and fear just because of where they're from?
Yeah, I think that it's something to obviously be aware of, and it's going to add that extra layer of paranoia, of anxiety, of fearfulness for their own safety. So, in a perfect world, it wouldn't happen at all, but we know that the societal face of America has shifted. And when people are scared, they're not at their best either. So, the recommendations in that situation is you still do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Other than that, there's nothing else you can do, because you're still going to have to periodically grocery shop and do other things. So it's more about developing and making sure you have the resources and support system that you can rely on. It just becomes even more important for people who are perhaps a bullied or targeted population right now.
Very good. Thank you so much for that advice. And also the acronym. I'm looking forward to us facing COVID together. That face COVID acronym is absolutely fantastic. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time. I really have enjoyed having you on. You have given our listeners just some fantastic advice. So thank you so much, Dr. Victoria Kelly, for your time. And
yeah, glad to be of help.
Oh, they're just outstanding. Will you make sure that you stay safe, stay home, and we really appreciate your insight today.
Yeah, I've got like 3 more Netflix specials I need to catch up on. So.
Well, good luck with that, and you'll hopefully have a little bit of time to do that.
Sounds good.
And as we previously previewed in the last segment, I will be speaking with one of my students in my virology class in a mini episode that we have broken off into a separate show. And so if you want to see me talk to one of my students about what she is experiencing in her life being here in America, it's a great interview, and I would encourage you to tune into that mini episode coming up later. So next, I wanted to kind of give everybody a preview of coming podcasts. So people have been asking what we're going to talk about. Now, this isn't an exclusive list. There are still many other interviews. I want to bring in research personnel. I'm going to be bringing in emergency personnel from the front lines in the coming weeks. But in addition to that, we will be having these podcasts on April 10th, information about vaccines. When will all ours arrive? On the 17th, we'll be talking about PPE, what works, what doesn't. The virology class is still coming up with the topic for the 24th. And then on the May 1st, we'll be talking about experimental medicine. So that gives you kind of a preview of coming attractions for Just the Facts podcast. Next, I wanted to come up with a way to kind of centralize your questions, have a way for you to be able to give us questions that we could have one list kind of put together. And so if you check out this website, it is www.slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. And you use the event code for the next week, 96396. Again, that's 96396. You can actually submit questions that will all be pooled to be handled by me, as well as my virology class and any other experts that we have come on the show. And so here's a brief video on how this process works.
Getting the best questions from your audience with Slido is really easy. Attendees simply need to Getting the best questions from your audience with Slido is really easy. Attendees simply need to join your event by going to slido.com and typing in your event code. Once they are logged in, they can start sending their questions. The audience can see and upvote the best questions on their mobile devices. With our paid plans, you can moderate the questions before they go live. All incoming questions will appear on the left-hand side to be reviewed, where you can approve or dismiss them. We recommend approving the questions as they come in to encourage the audience to participate and upvote the best questions. You can display the best questions on the presentation screen and highlight the one that is being answered by the speaker. Once it is answered, simply hide it by clicking the archive button, so only relevant questions remain live. When you finish the Q&A, it's recommended to archive all remaining questions to start each session afresh. Don't worry, all questions will be stored in the event archive.
So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what you'll be able to do. So if you have a chance, check out slido.com. Again, that's event code 96396 for the next week. You can check that out. So to wrap things up for today, I hope you got an update on where we're sitting with our current pandemic. We had a fantastic discussion with Dr. Kelly. I really appreciate her coming on the show. I gave you a little bit of a teaser of my talk with Irish coming up. You have an idea of what the future podcast might look like, and I really look forward to your feedback if you want to submit questions. So as always, I look forward to seeing you for our next podcast, where we will focus on what's going on in your around the nation, in your community, and most of all, we will focus on just the facts. See you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.